on to the next item on the agenda, we have Eric Olson joining us. And he's prepared a presentation to bring us all up to speed as we talk about short, mid, long range planning for shoreline management related topics. In particular, the 2025 beach nourishment project and our efforts in getting the Jaybird Shoal Bar site permitted. He'll touch on the sand management plan, Frying Pan Shoal Bar site permitting, and other concepts for future shoreline mitigation. As we know, we've been working on the possibility of other hardened structures, which we know at presently are not allowed under state law. So that's something that it will go over. So Eric, you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, I apologize because Chris is going to have to be my slide advancer. It's a little better than 35 millimeter slides, but at least we can go through them. Some of these slides you've seen, but I believe we have at least one new council person, so there probably is some redundancy with respect to what we've said in the past and showed you in the past, but we'll go through it all anyways. Chris, if you could advance. So anyhow, just to give you an idea of the normal sand loss on South Beach, it's somewhere in the vicinity of 300,000 to 400,000 cubic yards per year, which is a lot of sand. That's like 20,000 dump trucks. Now, not all of that comes out of the dry beach. That is actually the computation from the dune line out to about minus 16 feet. But that literally is the profile for South Beach. Both ends of the island are the most sensitive, historically have been the areas of interest where we've had to evaluate erosion control. Cape Fear Point being the most recent, and the changes there are natural. They're very large scale, and they're what we call geomorphological changes, which have to do with the morphology or the geology of not only the landform itself, but in this particular case, frying pan shoals. Next slide. Just to give you a little bit of history as to why we've had changes on the island. Most of this has to do with the initiation of the Federal Navigation Project through the Cape Fear River. In the 1800s, the project was initiated, but before it was initiated, we literally had a sand sharing system that existed between Oak Island and Bald Head Island, which you can see here, which is denoted by the very shallow shoals. And again, on the right-hand side, you can see that not only have the shoals been diminished over time, both naturally and through man-made operations. For example, the maintenance of the channel itself, historically, before about 2000, all of the material that came out of the channel in order to keep the federal navigation or the project navigable was taken offshore and was dumped. And so there were several tens of millions of cubic yards that were taken out of the system by the federal government prior to 2000. Next slide. So if we look at the conditions today, historically, the area of interest has been in the vicinity of the navigation channel. That's because we have both natural and obviously man-made changes at that location. More recently, since about 2008, we have been suffering an erosional hotspot on the east end of the South Beach, literally at Cape Fear. Next slide. On the west end, obviously, over time, there actually were structures that were lost, including a former club facility, in addition to a number of homes that were either lost or relocated more landward. Next slide. On the east end, prior to the development of the club, we had a very anomalous accretional formation, which looked like this, which has disappeared over time. It's a morphological change. associated principally with whether the frying pan shoals formation, which extends from here offshore, extending 30 miles southward, whether that formation attaches to the land or tries to attach to the land, or is segregated from the land due to a marginal flood channel, which becomes deepened over time during storm events. Next slide. As you can see here in the more recent past, that very anomalous condition is gone, and we've seen a number of variations, so to speak, in areas of accretion, which we've not seen, well, we've seen over the last 2 decades when we have begun monitoring. Next slide. Just another view, again, very anomalous situation. You can see that storms, some storm activity has skewed the sand in that vicinity in a more southerly direction towards Onslow Bay. It's a very unique situation. We've seen this occur in the last, I don't know, maybe 5 years or maybe a little bit more, but not before that. So again, it's what we see here is the frying pan shoals, the tail wags the dog with respect to whatever happens on the shoreline immediately landward of frying pan shoals. Next slide. Well, just to give you again an overview for which most of you know, with respect to the large-scale benefits of either nourishment constructed by the village or disposal events, which is tantamount to nourishment that occurs as a result of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers placing sand on South Beach as a result of the maintenance, derived from the maintenance dredging of the navigation project. Now, over time, and time in this particular case is measured only from about 2000, since we've been monitoring the beach, there now is, as of May of 22, there are almost 3 million cubic yards within the South Beach profile, extending from the dune line offshore to -16 feet, that did not exist prior to 2000. All of that is a result of either beach disposal by the Corps of Engineers or nourishment projects constructed by yourselves. Where that says 1982, that's an error. That should say actually 2000 or 2001. Obviously, the benefits of this, some of it is environmental habitat with respect to nesting for turtles. But the most important thing is improved storm protection, both for your infrastructure and for habitable structures. Next slide. So if we map the infusion of sand over time, as represented here from the beginning of about 2001, which is when the Corps of Engineers performed the last channel deepening, and a large quantity of sand, as indicated here, almost 1.6 million cubic yards, was placed on South Beach from that construction. The remainder of it, of the construction volume, went to Oak Island. So what we do is we map the volume of sand in the beach. You can see that over time it degrades, and then it jumps up again with some type of infusion, be it either a federal project or a village project. The most important thing to take away here is the fact that this whole trend is moving up. And that's the sign of a very successful beach nourishment project or beach management program, where the quantity of sand in your system that you're trying to address continually increases because you're putting more sand into the system than you're losing either naturally or through man-made features such as sand loss to the navigation project. Included in that are, of course, the terminal groin construction and also the reconstruction of the sand tube groin field, all of which helps maintain the sand on South Beach, and particularly at the west end of South Beach in proximity to the navigation project. So in 25, you'll basically see the line at the left. It will jump back up again. It'll probably be a little bit lower by the time we measure it, but then it will jump back up again with the infusion of additional sand into the system. Next slide. So as Chris noted, we have a fairly in-depth sand management plan here, which is probably attributable to the Wilmington Harbor Sand Management Plan, which again began in 2000 as a result of probably the village of, quite frankly, the village of Bald Head Islands and insistence that sand management had to occur in the future. That is to say that sand could no longer go offshore and it had to be put back into the system of the two barrier islands that border the navigation project. So the federal project was the genesis for your beach nourishment project, which began in about 1982. And over time, as we'll show you in a second, a schedule for sand placement has evolved. Now, again, simplistically, I think in the past we've alluded to the fact that your management plan is akin to a three-legged stool. One leg is structures, another leg is federal disposal of sand on South Beach, and the third leg is local nourishment or projects constructed by the village itself as required. Next slide. So again, this is the type of schedule that evolves, and we're just looking at 2015 to 2027. But what you see here is that federal disposal occurs 2 times on Bald Head, and then 1 time on Oak Island, and then goes back to a cycle of 2 times on Bald Head and one time on Oak Island. But what is required is that when the sand basically goes to Oak Island, the village is put in a position of having to construct a local project in order to meet the erosional needs of the island. And so that's why we're looking at a project in 25, which we'll discuss here in a second. Next slide. And again, as I mentioned, the federal plan, which is pretty well codified, at least at this point in time, which it literally evolved back in 2000, it was almost more politically generated, I think, than it was physically generated, because we took, we opposed this frequency of 2 out of 3 disposals to Bald Head Island on the basis of sand losses. Nonetheless, the Corps of Engineers decided to politically consider Oak Island more on a political basis than a physical basis. What we're dealing with in a typical maintenance project is about 1 million cubic yards of beach quality sand that needs to go on one island or the other. In our particular case, the vast majority of it goes on South Beach. The sand management plan, interesting enough, would allow sand placement on West Beach if necessary, but it's really not something we want to do because it's very, very difficult to place sand with the type of dredge that the Corps uses for these projects, which is a very large dredge. The sand quality within the navigation project varies. There are really 3 ranges that each contractor dredges. There's Bald Head Reach 1, Bald Head Reach 2, and there's the Smith Island range. Bald Head Reach 2 is the most southerly, or most southerly and the most oceanward reach. And the fact of life there is that the sand quality is not as good with respect to its grain size. So to speak, it's a finer sand. Now, also the disposal limitations are constrained by federal budgets. That is to say that the Fed has only so much money to construct the project, and they're going to do it in the least cost manner. Next slide. This is just a view of the way that the sand is dredged. This pipeline extends back to the navigation project, and you see here the type of process that's used to construct the berm on either the federal project or even your project. It's basically identical. So the beach is extended seaward some distance, depending on whether it's a federal project or it's a local project. And once that seaward berm is met, the berm then extends in an eastward direction. Next slide. Now, with respect to how far this sand goes, historically, due to the design of the federal project, they only get about 60% of the way down the shoreline towards Cape Fear. And again, the reason for this is that they maintain the least cost methodology with respect to the government budget and available. That is to say that to place the sand further to the east would cost more money, and their charge is to do the maintenance dredging in the least cost manner possible. So their goal is not to construct beach nourishment here. Beach nourishment is a sidebar. Their goal and their charge with respect to Congress is to maintain the channel, and so the least cost methodology is utilized with respect to disposal. Now, there are two occasions where there's one occasion where actually sand was placed all the way to Cape Fear. And that was back in 2001 when they did the channel deepening project. And so by design and by the insistence actually of the Village of Bald Head Island Council at the time, the fill extended all the way to Cape Fear, all the way down to basically to the club. There's actually a story with that, but I won't go into it because it almost did not occur. But the village politically insisted that the Corps meet that goal because they had alluded to meeting that goal in the planning and of the project on an early stages. In 21, the navigation channel had more than 1 million cubic yards available, almost to 1.5 million. And so the Corps did extend the disposal at that time. It almost got to the club, but it petered out just before that. Next slide. Coming up with the next village project to be constructed on the west end of South Beach, basically in 2025. There are two other actions here that are being addressed. One is to replace the sand tube groin field, which we normally do about every 5 to 6 years because the ends of the tubes wear out due either to impact from boats or just natural erosion of the tube itself due to its being in the active surf zone. And also an attempt to address the chronic erosion at the eastern port of South Beach near the Shoals Club. Next slide. Now, the sand tube groin field functions actually in concert with the terminal groin, and it protects both the road and the infrastructure at the point on South Beach where there is curvature in the shoreline, where, as associated with that, there's actually an accelerated sand transport. So the goal of the sand tube groin field is to slow down that sand transport, to keep a dune in place, and to protect both the infrastructure and the road itself. And of course, there is infrastructure, subgrade infrastructure in proximity to the road. This is an action that is supported by the Corps of Engineers because they know that when we slow down the transport of sand in this vicinity, it reduces the maintenance of the navigation project. Next slide. Next. Oh, sorry. The construction of the groin field is pretty unique, and that is to say that it's constructed in the dry. That means that we really can't construct these sand tubes out into the ocean in the manner that we'd like. So what we do is that every time when it becomes time to episodically replace the groin field, it's done in concert with a beach fill. And as you'll see in the next slide, in a second, we literally excavate out the old groin and replace it with a new groin, new sand tube in the dry, and then we bury it. We're back to utilizing Jaybird Shoals borrow site. And there's a story with that we'll get into in a second. But again, and that's a necessity, particularly if the village is building their project. And again, in order to build a beach fill sufficient to replace the groin field. If the Corps of Engineers is not doing it, then the village is required to do it. And again, part and parcel to that typically is the replacement of the sand tube groin field. So in order to do that, we obviously have to have a competitive situation for a dredging project. And all of these actions, both the beach fill and the groin field, are permitted functions or features. Next. So again, this is a view of the tube itself once it's exposed. This is a new tube that's been constructed. Again, you see it's in the dry, although the water is pumped down as required. It's the water table you see there. It's pumped down as necessary to implement the construction of the groin. Once the groin is constructed, we backfill it. It's covered over. You don't see it. The only thing you see at some point in time, usually after, I would say, a year or so after the fill has been placed, is the tips of the groins will then become activated. Next slide. So the second action that we're talking about here is the consideration of placing sand near the Shoals Club on the east end of South Beach. We're attempting to do this in a manner whereby when we go to bid for a dredging project, we will have a base bid, which will be the west end of South Beach. And we'll have an option, or actually two options, for placing sand on the east end of South Beach, which gives the village council the ability to control costs. Now, in an ideal situation, we had intended to use Frying Pan Shoals for this particular project and for the next sand placement, the upcoming sand placement on Bald Head Island. We actually initiated, as you'll see in a minute, permits almost 8 years ago in order to do that. And the reason we wanted to go to Frying Pan Shoals is, one, it's an infinite source of sand. There's actually, someone has computed that in its entirety, although we would not dredge large distances within Frying Pan Shoals, but there's like 1 billion cubic yards of material out there. But more importantly, in the vicinity of, within the 3-mile limit, within the state limits, and about a mile offshore, the material is extremely coarse, which means that it makes much better beach fill material. And the result of that is that when you construct a beach nourishment project with a coarser sand, its longevity is improved. And so you have a better probability of success, particularly in an area like the east end of South Beach, where we're facing a very unique erosion problem. And what happened is, in the course of the permitting of this, the only opposition we had were from 2 fishery groups, one state, one federal. And both of them basically indicated that they would oppose the utilization of Frying Pan Shoals as proposed. Next slide. So again, these are the 2 areas that we intend to address in the upcoming project. And again, the base fill is on the west end. It extends sufficiently eastward to be able to dispose of about 500,000 cubic yards of sand. And what we've asked for is a permit to place 1 million cubic yards of sand, with the potential opportunity to place an additional 500,000 cubic yards on the east end of South Beach. And as I alluded to before, we'll have 2 options there in the bid process. One will be the costing of 500,000 cubic yards. The second option, and the area of influence will change, obviously, and the design will change. But the second option would be to place up to 250,000 cubic yards. So the second option obviously could be exercised if the cost to place 500,000 cubic yards exceeded the available funding. Next slide. So what we were told to do in the permit process, when essentially we determined that the fisheries groups were going to oppose frying pan shoals, we were told to go back to jaybird shoals. And the nuances associated with that sand are twofold. One, it's a finer sand, much finer than frying pan shoals. And so we're back to placing a material which is slightly less desirable or less optimal compared to the frying pan shoals material. And also the additional costs associated with the pipeline length. So we're dealing with several miles of additional pipeline, which figures into the options and figures into the costing of those options. And it's not just the pipeline length itself, but as you might imagine, the longer the pipeline gets from the borrow site to where it's being placed on the shoreline, the lower the productivity of the dredge because of just the frictional aspects of the pipe itself and the sand and the effluent going through it. So the productivity of the dredging contractor goes down. That's to say the number of cubic yards he can place per day goes down, and effectively the cost then of each cubic yard goes up. Next slide. This is a picture actually of the prior Jaybird Shoals borrow site that we have utilized in the past. Everything that is defined within the limits of that borrow site has been expended with the two projects that you constructed. Not indicated here is a slight extension of that borrow site to essentially to the north towards the words Jaybird Shoals, where we have earmarked approximately a little over 1 million cubic yards within that shoal to be utilized for the next project, the upcoming project in 2025. Next slide. This is a view of how far the Corps got in 21 with their maintenance dredging project. They almost got to the Shoals Club, but not quite. And so this is essentially how it ended up. You can see here the contractor trying to push up material towards the dry beach, which he effectively did. But the fact of life is that the material that was placed here came out of Bald Head Reach 2 and is the finer material that comes out of the navigation project. So besides the shortcoming, we also had material that was placed with a very fine grain size, which again portends poorer performance with respect to nourishment. So even though material was pushed up here in the short term, that material was not very long lasting. Next slide. So the rhetorical question that comes up, or has continued to come up, what are the options for the solving the problem at the Shoals Club and the Cape Fear vicinity? Well, one potential option is the channel maintenance that is performed every 2 years and is placed episodically on Bald Head Island. The way that would occur, however, which means that the Corps, instead of placing all the material on the west end of South Beach, they would place some on the east-south end of South Beach, will require negotiation and some form of contract between the village and the Corps, with the village being responsible for paying for any delta costs. So instead of the least cost option being constructed, there will be another option constructed whereby there's an additional cost, and that cost would have to be defrayed by the village. And the village is presently in the process of trying to negotiate such a flexibility into the federal contract. Another upcoming event, which we don't know when this will occur, is the planned harbor deepening and the expansion of the navigational channel in proximity to Bald Head Island, both vertically and horizontally. So what that means is that when they deepen the channel, there will, again, just as in 2000, there will be a fairly large quantity of beach quality sand available for placement either on Bald Head Island and or Oak Island. And so at that point in time, depending on the volume available, there may be an option, or there may be availability of getting sand all the way down to the east end of South Beach, so similar to what occurred back in 2000 with the last deepening project. Of course, we have the Village project coming up in 2025. Again, as I indicated, we will bid 2 options for placement of sand on the east end. And subsequent to that, we expect that we're going to have to go back and duke it out with respect to the permitting of a borrow site and frying pan shoals. Just for a number of reasons, but one basic reason is that we can't forever continue to take sand out of jaybird shoals. It's not an infinite resource like frying pan shoals is. Frying pan shoals, interestingly enough, not only is a huge resource, it's a renewable resource, which means that if I constructed a borrow site in frying pan shoals, with such a dynamic area that we have proposed in the past, you probably wouldn't even see that borrow site in 5 years. That is to say, it would fill up with material. Another rhetorical question is, could we build structures at the east end of South Beach? I won't say similar to the west end, but structures which would be intended to impound sand, because it's one of the only ways that we can offset the dynamics that we have there at the present time. Next slide. So again, these are the, and I think I really went over this, but really the frying pan shoals is, in the long term, it is the ideal borrow site for the continuation of village projects. It's the most cost effective, certainly for addressing things on the east end of South Beach. It is by far and away the most suitable sand. It unfortunately has one environmental issue, which has to do with fisheries, which we believe is really not an issue. At least our environmental consultants believe it is not an issue that should warrant such an objection. And so we intend to go back into the process of reinitiating the permitting. At the present time, we were forced to terminate the permitting of that and to renew the permitting of jaybird shoals. Next slide.
Can you give us a little more insight into what the objection from the fisheries is?
Well, they believe that it has, and again, I'm the engineer, not the environmental guy. They tend to believe that it has unique attributes with respect to certain types of fisheries during certain times of the year. It's not well explained. Quite frankly, we believe that what they don't want to do is open Pandora's box with respect to utilizing the either frying pan shoals or any of the other two. There are 2 other headlands in the state which have very similar formations to frying pan shoals. And even though I believe the legislature has indicated that these should be evaluated for purposes of sand resource, they believe that these areas are unique. They do not have any quantitative information. Matter of fact, the village volunteered to generate quantitative information to address their concerns through environmental monitoring, through fishery counts, things of a nature that you would do when there's some objection that is not well quantified. But they wouldn't have it. They both at the federal level, the National Marine Fisheries, part of U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and also the state equivalent, both entities said they would object to the permit being issued. So it's a very difficult permit to get. But I think the fact of life is that we're going to have to go back and to readdress that issue. Now, interestingly enough, BOEM, Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, is actually studying frying pan shoals, principally outside the state limits. as a future borrow site for the federal government. That to some degree complicated our permit request to perform dredging within the area that we're interested in, within the state waters. They could point to that as a reason not to do anything until those results were known. We don't believe that they probably will. Well, you never know. I mean, there may be some interesting, some aspects of that study which are informational that could be used by our environmental consultants. But again, it was sort of just a delaying tactic, which was pretty much irrefutable. That the federal government spending several $1 million in several years studying those offshore portions of frying pan shoals, and the federal government, typically U.S. Fish and Wildlife, says, well, you need to wait for those results. So we were put in a box where, in order to construct the project in 2025, we had to withdraw our permit and to reinitiate permitting in Jaybird Shoals. They basically said, go back to Jaybird Shoals. But even in that, we're still getting, we've gotten some adverse comments in our permitting process, none of which we believe are insurmountable. So as is indicated here, it was almost 8 years ago that we made application to do that. And that was several years before there actually was any proposal to do an offshore study by BOEM. So we were into the process, I think maybe 5-6 years before the feds decided to do to fund a study offshore, which then became a sort of a legitimate objection for some of these agencies. Next slide. And just to give you, this is just a view of the area that we are intending to utilize. And again, you can see it's in the red here is a very shallow area, which means it's a very, very dynamic area. And anybody that's ever viewed that area on a windy day, you can see it's like a washing machine out there, which means that borrow site, which actually the borrow site that we were going to use is actually smaller than that footprint there, because we reduced it just to reduce the footprint of impact to make it more palatable. But that borrow site would basically infill within 2 to 3, 5 years at the most. You wouldn't be able to discern where it was. So it actually would be the ideal borrow site in that it literally would be renewable. Next slide. So other actions considered by the village. There's been discussion over the years to potentially convert the sand tube groins to rock structures, which at this point in time is not allowed by law. And also to construct some form of a structure at Cape Fear, such as a small terminal groin or perhaps several small groins, to impound sand and to keep sand on the beach in the vicinity of the Shoals Club. And again, that's legislatively or permit-wise, regulatory-wise, neither of these is allowable. So at this point in time, they cannot be permitted. The feasibility of either action, it's not only questionable, but it's impossible. Now, with that said, the village is taking proactive measures to try to initiate legislation that would allow for these type of actions. And Charles Baldwin of Brooks Pierce is heading up that effort. It did not get into it did not get considered last year, and it's my understanding from conversation with Charles that it's going to be proffered again this year in order to try to get the regulatory permissions that allow for these type of actions on South Beach for obvious reasons. Next slide. And with that said, be glad to answer any questions or to fill in any blanks, areas that I may have omitted.
Yeah, Eric, one of your early slides, you were showing the West End and South Beach, and over the course of 20 years, the constant adding sand to the system, the baseline is rising. When we're looking at the east end now, down by the Shoals Club, and you're looking at at least the possibility of adding sand down there. In the long run, we need to be adding sand on, I'm projecting on this. If you're taking the same approach, you'd have to be adding sand to the system on East Beach on a regular basis as well. Unless we start getting a new terminal groin or we get a groin field put in. Is that correct? So the intention of this 25 plan is to start doing that, adding sand to the system so that we would be increasing the, having a rising baseline on the east end as well.
It is. With it being understood that into the future, it's also a fact of life as to whether or not you can afford to keep sand down there, which all depends upon the performance of what is constructed in 25. We know what happens on West Beach or the west end of South Beach, but we do not know what the performance of either of these fills, be it of 250,000 cubic yards or 500,000 cubic yards, will be.
So if I'm looking at, the suggestions or future plans that you're talking about, combination of the MOA with the Corps of Engineers to be able to tap into their normal beach fill, their channel cleansing process, dredging the channel.
Right.
That idea is that we could actually, with that MOA, possibly be adding sand down on the east end on a regular basis until other either frying pan shoals or terminal groin, et cetera, get put in place.
Yes, that would be an option. And again, it probably depends on what the Corps tells you is the delta cost. But yeah, that would be a physical option. Once you negotiate this through an MOA with the Corps, and they would that allows them to bid sand placement down there. They would probably do the same thing we would do, is they would bid a base price, and then they would also probably bid an option for putting sand on the east end, and then you would know what the delta cost in the overall contract is, and assuming you have a funding source, you would be able to reimburse the Corps for that amount.
Yeah. Thanks.
Did I understand right? One of your slides, it seemed that you indicated that we wouldn't know when sand might be available from the harbor deepening project. Is that still in debate when that's going to start?
It is in debate, yes. They're still doing studies. The original studies for the channel deepening were done by the Port Authority. That responsibility then was subsumed by the Corps of Engineers, who are sort of reinitiating all of the studies over and again, procedurally. And so they're, under NEPA and another plethora of regulatory charges, they're reevaluating it from a physical standpoint, a costing standpoint, and environmental standpoint. So we really, to the best of my knowledge, they can't tell us when that project will be constructed. It could be 10 years. We just don't know. And then once they've done their studies and have their permits and environmental assessments done, of course, they will, at that point in time, they will need funding to do it. And so that's from Congress. And that's another aspect that will drive the timing of the project. But to the best of my knowledge, and Chris can correct me, is they haven't given us any real estimate.
Yeah, they, our federal lobbyists will have some more details on that, but to go back, when the North Carolina State Ports Authority initiated the study under that Section 203 process, whereby the Ports Authority hired the consultants to do the original studies, and they had probably a half dozen of stakeholder meetings that we were engaged in with, and Eric between Eric and our legal team, we provided public comment, and I can share that with you in particular, Scott, so you can orient yourself with that. But to the extent that while there was a lot of good studies done, there was some major flaws in the studies and one in particular that they didn't do, which was the hydrogeology or hydromorphology of the inlet, which is of particular interest to us in terms of its impacts to our shoreline. And we recognize that, we stated that, and that still has to be done. But I think even when that study made its way on up to the Assistant Secretary of the Army, they came back with a written report that that corroborated or supported all of our comments and a lot of other agencies' comments. A lot of adjacent municipalities from us on up to Wilmington. I think a big difference in this go around with the deepening project they're proposing versus the one back in the early 2000s is that the only ones that really cared about it back then was us.
Right.
It was not much eye on that back then. And so, but
Well, this one's a good bit bigger too, by an order of magnitude, isn't it?
well, the last one went from 38 feet to 42 feet.
Right,
This one's going from 42 feet to 47 feet.
right.
But I don't think it has anything necessarily to do with the size and whatnot. I just think it's a change in times.
Yeah.
Much more people are focused on this from the environmental concerns of the Coastal Federation, the Cape Fear River Watch. So there's still a lot of work to be done, and I think we're engaged in that, and our lobbyists will share some of that in the next item.
Eric, just upshot of that deepening project, there's the anticipation is that at the very beginning, there's going to be a big influx of sand that might be available to us. But does it stand to reason that in the course of maintaining that deeper channel, there's also, instead of the 1 million cubic yards on a normal dredging cycle, it would be increased because it's a deeper channel?
There is that possibility. A lot of the maintenance, the increases in maintenance really has to do with storm activity. You'll get a major storm and you'll get more infilling, let's say, over a 12 or 24 month period than normal. Yeah, there is that possibility. And again, it depends on how that channel is affected by the adjacent shoals that it goes through. Because some of it, there is going to be, not only is there deepening, but in order to have a deepening, you have to do a slight widening. And so the flanks of the channel will be increased in certain areas. And again, particularly in the first few years, there would be an increased maintenance at that time for sure.
And just to add, I think you'll recall too that this would provide an opportunity that we would want to revisit the sand management plan and make sure we have codified, in particular, as Eric's mentioned, the sand share ratio. That it's right now it's 2 to 1, and we've done the work in the studies that show it's more like 4 to 1. And so, but obviously that's going to be some hurdles politically, and yeah, you've heard the term sand war. It's not. I mean, it can be a reality in some instances.
It will be here. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that as part of the proposed plan, you're gonna have a big dredge spoil area offshore, disposal area. So you might want to keep an eye on that and try to, if it does go through, ask for mitigation, say, instead of dumping that offshore, like, let's use it for beneficial uses. I mean, they're looking for ways to mitigate, so
Sure.
it's a good opportunity.
Yeah, but also recognizing probably a good part of that is not beach compatible material, that it's river mud from upriver that they're dumping in the offshore disposal site. But no, I agree. If it's beach compatible, beach quality sediment, it needs to be put back on the shoreline.
And it's supposed to be. But sometimes it becomes difficult when you're dealing with a mix of good material and bad material, and the village and others affected need to observe that very closely in the design of the project so that good material is not wasted just because it's proximate to bad material. Because the material at depth is not good. The good material is all above minus 24 feet in this area.
Yeah, Eric, this is Scott, Scott Gardner, excuse me. One quick question. When we talk about a soft growing field on the east end or the possibility of some sort of terminal growing structure, as I understand it, sand flows from north to south on East Beach and from west to east on South Beach, right?
From about the center of the island, it goes
Yes.
goes eastward, and then to the west of that, it goes westward.
Got it. Fair enough.
There's what
Fair
we
enough.
call a nodal point, and I should have made note of that. It's in one of those slides. But yeah, there's a division of in the net. Of course, sand moves both ways on the beach, but in the net, it splits.
Got it. But in both cases, I mean, anything we would want to do in terms of constructing anything, soft growing wise, terminal growing wise, would be to do it in such a way that it doesn't have a negative impact on either East Beach or West Beach. The idea would be to design it in a way that it helps both, correct?
Yes. Well, it would help South Beach. You want to do it without any negative aspects to East Beach.
Got it.
And
Okay, thank you.
it would not be difficult. It would just take a low structure, one that's fairly porous, but just would cause enough impoundment to protect the club facility. So it doesn't have to be anything like we've constructed in proximity to the river. The terminal structure. When we say terminal structure, it would not be anything like that. It would be much more modest.
Thank you.
I'm looking at this accretional event here. Just, this could happen again. This is an interesting phenomena that is depicted by this photography. And there's two things that are salient there. Notice the little lakes that are within the accretion itself. What that means is this accretion occurred very, very rapidly, which means that this accretion occurred from offshore. That is to say that this is sand that moved onshore from Frying Pan Shoals at some point in time. It is feasible, or when I say feasible, it is possible that that could occur in the future. We don't know. We can't predict what happens with Frying Pan Shoals, but this could be the result of some type of a storm event which reacted with Frying Pan Shoals and moved sand in a landward direction rapidly enough that water was retained or encompassed by that sand movement. And so those little lakes are indicative of a very rapid accretional event. We should be so lucky to have it occur again. But it is, I won't say that it's impossible. It is possible.
Eric, thanks so much. We're at